It is the year 1733. Lutheran pastors Johann Martin Bolzius and Israel Christian Gronau are part of a group of Salzburg emigrants bound for the new colony of Georgia on the vessel Petersburg. All on board have been suffering from either hunger, illness, or both from the poor quality of food being given to them. The two clergymen write, "Very miserable fare. The meat is very salty and tough, and the peas that are cooked with it are also bad. Drink is likewise sour. We too partake of such fare. May God let it agree with us. Because the dear Salzburgers get only one meal a day, and poor and scanty at that, and the hard ship's biscuit is so dry that they can't put it in their stomachs. They buy cheese from the helmsman, a pound for 6 stivers, whereupon they show themselves as grateful as if it were given to them." In November of 1786, German passenger Eberhardine Christiana Lotter was on board the brig Dispatch, on voyage from Rotterdam for Nova Scotia. She too kept a diary of her journey. All passengers learned to loathe the so-called ship's bread. The biscuits deserve special mention. We receive 6 pounds per week. They come in all pieces, black, without flavor or taste, like a clod, and hard as a rock. For quite a while I did not know how to get at them, until at long last hunger and privation brushed aside all disgust, and taught me how to bite and chew. Often I dampened them with water to soften them. I also tried them on the fire once, but the captain strictly forbade us to do so, because it could bring us instant sickness. And I noticed that the biscuit teemed with worms as soon as it was warmed up. That resulted from the fact that the leftovers are taken along on the next trip and are never thrown out, even if they were 100 years old. None of our food was to be looked at by light. Danderfunk, salt junk, and scurvy. Cuisine aboard ships. Today on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Today I have a guest that is going to discuss a really interesting topic and something that is actually kind of a secret favorite of mine, and that is how food was provisioned and served and eaten on board ships. It's often a forgotten detail and could really make or break a voyage, but joining me today is Greta Harden, host of the History of American Food podcast. Greta, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for doing this with me. And my favorite thing is this all came about because we were just sort of, I think we were snarking about something on Threads or something. I'm like, wait a second. I
I'm
think
sure
you'd be
we
fun
were.
to talk to.
Yeah, and after we got going and started talking about this a little bit more, I thought, oh, this is going to be good. This is going to be a fun one. Oftentimes, especially my podcast, often we're talking about death and injuries and loss and grief, and it takes on kind of a sorrowful tone. But today we have a chance to lighten it up a little bit. We will talk about scurvy and some other diseases, but in general, we're going to talk about just how this whole process of feeding all these sailors progressed through the years. And really, there's 2 periods here. There's before canning and after canning. And so that's kind of how we're going to split this up a little bit. Let's talk first about the longer voyages. When we think about these longer voyages, the age of exploration, as the Spanish and the Dutch and the English and Portuguese were setting sail across these oceans, they knew they were going to be gone for many, many months. So how did they even begin to prepare?
Well, that's a really fun thing to look at because I'm coming at this always from the food direction. And you look at some of the early voyages, and all of these people were having to reprovision like every couple of weeks. Like you look at Vasco da Gama and how, he's trying to go around Africa and everything. He's not sailing around Africa. He's pinballing off the side of it because he doesn't have enough food. I mean, he's in a terrifyingly little ship to begin with. But for me, it was kind of this funny, like chicken and egg thing. These people figuring out like, how can we make food last longer so we can take these longer voyages now that we're better at building ships. And then once they had food that could last longer, they changed the way shipping worked. Like there weren't blockades before they figured out how to keep food on board for longer. Like shipping and the food technology like fed on each other, which was super cool, or terrible if you were a sailor. Because the sailors actually had better food before they figured out how to do food preservation.
And that's because they were able to, they brought livestock on board.
Yeah.
And I know even with going back even more so than the Europeans, but the Chinese had ships specifically for growing vegetables.
I was going to say they had garden ships.
Yeah, garden ships, yeah. So, I mean, that's really interesting to think about because even later on, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, that wasn't really happening. There were supply ships, to be sure, but not garden ships.
No. Well, you also are working with the English who are a little bit suspicious of vegetables anyway. And kind of saw fruits as a little bit of a luxury, especially preserved fruits. Like, as far as I know, 17th century England was basically overrun with plums. And if you had just packed every boat with barrels of dried prunes, you would have solved a lot of the problem. But they're like, none of this fancy treaty thingies for these sailors. We'll send them off with 10-year-old salted beef. Maybe it's beef. It's probably beef. Who cares?
Beef-like substance.
Yes. I mean, it's funny that even supplying the British Navy changed the shape of British agriculture.
When they started to even consider going on these voyages, who would they go to for their provisioning? And what would that look like?
Usually there would be somebody who had worked with the Navy, and the Navy and the Army were kind of like, they knew each other. And so they'd sort of figured out, okay, you've got to salt the ever-living dickens out of the beef because they, had salt cod and sort of had figured it out, and you just brine that like crazy. So just military food procurement was just sort of this cartel of guys that had this stuff in stores and would work with the different farmers. Eventually, the Navy created their own ovens to do biscuit. And so they were just industrially pumping out these ships' biscuit. And so you could buy biscuit from the Navy, even if you were a private explorer. But of course, depending on like how good of graces you were in, you might get like extremely expired biscuit, or some naval ship might get extremely expired biscuit.
And preserving the food was kind of a big deal because this was the era before canning. So they were eating better food quality, at least sometimes.
Well, they were eating better quality food before they got good at preserving food in barrels. When you had to go ashore every 2 or 3 weeks, right. That's when they had better food. But once they figured out how to salt the beef, how to do the biscuit, how to get these harder cheeses from the Dutch in wax, actually talked to some women about salting butter and then also submerging that in salt water. They're like, this stuff will last like what? Forever, practically. I'm not eating it. 10 years is fine. It's fine. I mean, that is one of the things that I enjoy. Okay, I have weird hobbies. But enjoy reading like these little like throwaway lines in stuff like Mutiny on the Bounty or other depictions of these long sailing voyages, and where people are like carving objects out of salt beef that's so hard that it's just like wood. Like it's It's not even food anymore. It's a building material.
Yeah. How long did they have to, how do they prepare the salt beef and salt pork? I know you said you have to salt the dickens out of it, but what did that look like? How long did they have to do it, to preserve it?
So pretty much what you're doing is you're taking your cut of meat and you are rubbing it in salt and letting some of the water drain off. And then you just put it in brine so strong that that an egg would like float up in it. So basically you would dissolve as much salt as you could into it until no more salt was dissolved. It was absolutely saturated with salt. And then you would just throw your partially drained salted beef in there. And over time, the water inside the beef would all leave the beef because osmosis, water always goes where there's a higher concentration of solids. And so if you leave your beef in there long enough, like every single cell is absolutely collapsed. And yeah, it's like wood. Now, over time, people would do things to speed up the salting process where they would just like take a bunch of beef, throw it in a barrel and just cover it with salt. They wouldn't partially drain it. And this also made like really terrible stuff. I mean, they were taking all sorts of shortcuts. It was common to have like hooves and jaws and just like bony, non-edible parts, but they kind of like bury it down under the stuff that had meat on it. And we talk about sick animals now going into our food supply, like the whole mad cow disease, and they had the downer cows and whatever. Oh yeah, they would take like actively dead, like not just like recently dead. They're like, it's just for sailors. It's only been there a week. Let's throw that in there. Is that a donkey? Who knows? Who cares?
Oh gosh.
So not great. Not great.
And then comes the even more interesting part. How did they cook and prepare this salted pork or beef or whatever it happened to be?
Animal product.
So, salted beast, let's say.
We'll go with that. That's fine.
Prepare it into something that is even remotely edible.
So once you had these ships that were afloat for a long time, you would have the galley, you'd have the cook in there. And what he would do is he would have a set of bricks and he would basically build a fire pit on the floor of the boat. And you're like, wait, but aren't boats made out of wood with all of their holes plugged with flammable substances? And you go, yes, they are. So
they're lathered with pitch and you're starting a fire. Great.
But yeah, you'd build this fire pit out of brick on the floor, and then you'd build the fire inside that, and then you would hang a cauldron from one of the beams on chains over this fire pit. And you would get the water going, and they talk about messes on a boat. And what they mean is it's a group of like 6 to 8 guys who eat together. They often have their bunks together. They might work the same cannon together. They were sort of this organizational structure. And so they would have a mess cloth. And so their portion of meat would go inside that cloth. And oftentimes they'd put some dried peas in there as well, tie that sucker up, and they'd have like a tag that had their little symbol, because a lot of these guys weren't literate. So it'd be like a dog or a chicken or, some little clay thingy with a carving or a stamp on it or something. And all of these bags would go into the pot and get cooked in there. And so you'd sort of end up with this salty, fatty broth that everything was cooking in. And of course, because you're on a boat for a long time, there's not a lot of water, that water would get used for a couple of meals. If you were good and lucky and your captain liked you and you had good supplies, sometimes they would take these claws and they would coat them with a wet flour mixture and then sort of make a batter with some sugar and flour, and occasionally there would be some raisins and some fat maybe, and wrap that in the bag and cook that up, and that would be a pudding or a duff. So that's where plum duff comes from. And so you'd get these 2 bags, and you'd take them to your mess and you'd open it up and you'd scoop it out and into everybody's, little wooden trencher bowl thingamawhat's Yum.
And the messes, as you were explaining, that was really a time for socializing and bonding with the other guys on the ship, because the rest of the time they were working or sleeping. They really didn't have much time to bond or talk, just kind of be regular people. So
Right, yeah, it's sort of like they in commercial kitchens now, they're like, yeah, if there's time to lean, there's time to clean. It's like,
yeah, right.
I don't care if the deck is clean. It's dirty now because you looked at it. So chop chop.
When you're talking about this food that just gets put in the bag with the peas and the whatever else they have with the salted meat, and they just put it in this bag and boil it.
Mm-hmm.
The end result is going to be, the first thing that came to mind actually was something like haggis.
A bit like that. It's missing the grain portion of that. Though that would sometimes be substituted, or that was often substituted with ship's biscuit. And I had talked about that they were turning this out on an industrial scale. And what it was flour and water made into a paste and then cooked to be rock hard, like hopefully hard enough that the bugs couldn't get it. Sometimes there was some salt in it, sometimes not. But the joke was on them because the bugs could always soften it up for you.
Yeah. It provides moisture.
Moisture? Maybe you can get some of your vitamin C from eating the weevils because they can produce it in their little bodies, whereas humans and strangely guinea pigs cannot. Most other animals can auto-produce vitamin C. But that would sometimes be cooked in there, with the meat and the peas. And actually, on most boats, there was a rotation where it wasn't the same every night. You would have like 2 days that would be meat, 2 days that would be stockfish, saltfish, some kind of dried fish. And then one day would just be like cheese.
I saw a sample of a typical ration for the week, and it was from the American Navy, so we're talking early 1800s. It was just like you said, that one day was only bread, cheese, molasses, and rice. But on the other days, it was kind of a alternating salt beef, salt pork. But there was always cheese and bread in there somewhere. So they were at least trying, I think, to have. I don't know if they had the concept of the food groups or the food pyramid that we have now, but I
No.
think they recognize some variety at least to try to give everybody.
Yeah, the alternating thing, it's like, we don't want to like overspend and coddle these guys, but on the other hand, we don't want them to decide like, jumping off the boat and dying is actually better, or just absolute mutiny and running away. So they were always trying to like cut that fine line. And I mean, they were sort of working with like, what was their understanding of what people needed to work? Because you needed these guys to work. And so bread was king, and so some substitute for bread or bread itself. You'd often start off voyages with bread in a net, and that would last for as long as it lasted. And then, they recognized that some sort of protein, meat or cheese was in there. They had not figured out the vitamin thing. That was true. And cold weather people, don't see a lot of vegetables, and they don't play a big part in their cuisines. And so they're like, how important could it be?
And at that time, they didn't really understand any kind of, micronutrients or the organic compounds or that we have now, and vitamins and minerals. So they could see trends. If somebody wasn't healthy and they weren't eating well, they would just need to eat more. And, but
Right.
there was no concept of vitamins.
No.
Obviously, because scurvy, which we'll introduce now, scurvy obviously was a huge problem for a long time.
Yeah, you could lose like a third or a half of your crew to scurvy on any given voyage, and people are like, that's what happened.
Yeah.
You
And they
plan
planned for it. Exactly. They would put more people on the ship knowing that a third of them would die. And scurvy it wasn't that they didn't know it existed. There's records of scurvy going back even to the ancient Egyptians, describing the symptoms at least of scurvy.
Oh, yeah.
But why it was occurring, at least for the Europeans, that was not well known. But um, how did that progress through time? How did they start to realize there was a problem, and what did they try to do about it?
Well, for a long time, again, when these boats weren't able to stay out for a long period of time, it wasn't a big problem because it takes about 60 days for like scurvy to set in. And for people who don't know, basically, scurvy is your body unraveling. What vitamin C does is it holds your connective tissue together. And so, like, that's why you have heart trouble. Your heart muscle is sort of like becoming limp and mushy. That's why you lose your eyesight. Your eyeballs are kind of coming apart, and that's why your teeth fall out, and that's why you bruise. Like, it's a connective tissue disease. It's super disgusting.
Yeah.
And different cultures, and even different countries were recognizing this. I mean, the English get all of this credit, at least in English history, for, figuring it out. And it was this Scottish doctor, and he did this experiment. And no, he did an experiment, but he like didn't even notice like what was going on. Because you look at the Germans and you look at the Dutch, like every boating culture was like, whoa, when these people are out to sea for too long, they start to fall apart in extremely disgusting ways. And
Yeah.
so there would be like the Germans were really into using sauerkraut. And if you make sauerkraut the traditional way where you salt ferment the cabbage, it actually does preserve the vitamin C to a certain extent. But if you make sauerkraut the lazy, cheap British way where you just boil the cabbage in vinegar, you don't keep the vitamin C. And so some of the early writing is very varied because they're like, well, I tried sauerkraut and it worked. It was great. And they're like, yeah, but I tried sauerkraut and it didn't work. So vegetables are bunk. But I really think that the English, because since I mainly do history in English and that's where my concentration is, they really started to get a handle on it when the English started getting more outposts in tropical areas and so had a lot more access to fruit and specifically citrus fruit because of all of those oils in their peels, keeps for a decent amount of time on board.
Yeah, and as they started to realize this, I remember reading about I believe it was the Portuguese. They would plant citrus fruits at different points around the Atlantic Ocean. Like they planted citrus trees in St. Helena.
Yeah.
They would put their sick on the island to eat the fruit and say, just try to catch the next ship that comes along. And they were noticing that these men were healthy the next time that they saw them, or when they were picked up.
They'd be like, get back on the boat. They're like, nah, I'm good.
That was pretty smart to do that. They started planting citrus trees around the islands and the West Indies, etc., to spread this.
Yeah, the Spanish were very into that as well. In fact, the island of Curacao, where that orange liqueur comes from, is one of those islands that they just like threw some orange seeds at the shore as they left and like, grow. But a lot of these oranges that they were growing are these like incredibly like bitter, sour oranges, which are great in savory cooking. You'll see in a lot of Mexican cooking, they have a lot of sour orange in it because of the same reason. The Spanish just like, they're like, yeah, we need some orange trees, plant them. Yeah, the Spanish and the Portuguese, with their exposure to Arab medicine, had a lot more respect for the medicinal and healthful qualities of a whole bunch of plant foods. Whereas the English are like, vegetables, optional and kind of gross. I don't know.
There's plenty of citrus trees, and especially in northern Africa, so that makes a lot of sense. I didn't realize that, but that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it is funny kind of seeing a lot of different attitudes between the Spanish and the English, who hate each other, and their different exposures to different cultures. They hate each other unless there's Napoleon involved, then they can get along okay.
Right, exactly. as we progress through time now, the invention of canning comes along. How did that come about and when?
So the official guy who gets the credit for canning is Nicolas Appert, or Nicholas Appert for those of us who read it in English. And he was sort of a chemist, an experimenter, a food procurer guy, um, who saw this reward that Napoleon's army was offering, because they're like, you know what is hard is the food thing. Like, you can only have an army of 100,000 dudes descend upon any given spot on the map before people are just like, just no, we're out. it's, it's empty. And so they had to come up with a way to bring food along, and then bring food along that wouldn't go bad. And because barrels, they pop open. A barrel's a big thing. You can't just like somehow send a group of 10 dudes out somewhere to like move along quickly. There's no field kit of food that's preserved. And so people had been screwing around with preserving food inside stuff. And because glass bottles were starting to become a little bit cheaper and the mechanization of making glass was coming along, they started doing it in bottles first. And the French Navy actually did several experiments with it. And they're like, not bad. It's got the texture of baby food, but we're all in great shape. So we'll put up with that. Because the tops of these bottles were just very minuscule. Like, you're putting in 1 pea at a time. And so it took metal tech catching up, and like rolling mills and soldering technology and all of that coming together before they went from bottling into cans. But once food went into these metal cans, yeah, the world changed. Because the other thing is, bottled foods were mainly like weird rich people food. It was expensive. And so was even early canned food.
It probably would be kind of a shock too to these sailors who often were, not judging, but the dregs of society that they get from, bars and the skid row of these ports, through impressment.
Oh,
So,
yeah. They'd be like, you want to go to jail or you want to go on a boat?
exactly.
Your choice. Oh, wait,
Right.
it's not your choice. Boat. We're at
Right.
war.
Right.
Get on the boat.
And how did this help with dealing with things like scurvy and probably other diseases like rickets and things like that?
So when you cooked the food inside the can, it actually kept a lot of those nutrients that were just being completely leached out um, into into that water. And so like you were talking about rickets, which is a lack of calcium. If you take fish and you can it, the bones kind of dissolve into the flesh. And so it actually has like this higher calcium content. And so people sort of like look down their nose at something like canned salmon now, but compared to rock hard salt cod that's been cooked in this beefy, salty water, you're like, this is actually a delight.
Yeah.
And then you could also have the vegetables. It didn't help so much with the scurvy, just because the temperatures that they were cooking the vegetables at to preserve them in the cans, that would destroy the vitamin C. It is a heat sensitive nutrient.
So they would have to have some kind of fresh food on board, or at least some kind of citrus juice, as we'll find out.
Yeah, yeah. So that was a long time for them to figure it out. Like, they knew, okay, citrus juice seems to work really well. I mean, any sort of fresh vegetables and fresh meat all has vitamin C. It's great. But yeah, the citrus kept really well. And so they thought, well, hey, maybe if we just juice the citrus, that'll take up less room. They won't rot. And so they would then boil the citrus juice to sterilize it. And now suddenly it's not working.
Right.
So they kind of went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, figuring out ways of how to take along citrus juice. And they did figure out ways to lower temperature can the juice later on, but that's after we get out of the age of sail. I mean, other than taking on fresh provisions, and some people did sort of figure out the sauerkraut conundrum, being in a European Navy was, you just wanted to see land. That's all you wanted, man.
Yeah.
And they also figured out that if you can't keep people on board, or you can't keep people without fresh provisions for longer than X, because you just start losing people too fast.
Yeah, and with this new technology of canning comes a new industry. And with new
Yes,
industry comes profiteering and
you betcha.
corruption and trying to cut corners and things like that. So what comes to mind is probably one of the most obvious examples is the Franklin expedition, and in which the canning process, at least this is a theory, I don't know if it's been proven, but
Hmm.
the canning process that was used in the food that was purchased for the Franklin expedition wasn't really up to snuff, and some of the tin the lead rather, I'm sorry, the lead solder
Yeah, the lead solder.
was
Yeah.
leaching into the food, which caused at least some of the crew, theoretically, to die of lead poisoning.
And this isn't a crazy idea, because they saw it in a couple of other situations where they're always trying to figure out, like, okay, how do I keep my citrus juice? And so there were a couple of other expeditions where they would make lead tanks to put the lime juice or the lemon juice in and store it that way. And then they also got lead poisoning. And for all the people who are like, what's up with lead? Why is everybody putting everything in lead?
They
And
didn't
it's
know.
because, it's a soft metal. It doesn't corrode um the same way a lot of other things do. Like, there's a lot going for it, and people really liked working with it. It's also very easy to mine. You can just sort of melt it out of rocks at really hot fire temperature. You think about iron, and there's 98 million steps you have to go through to sort of successfully create iron. Whereas with lead, you can just take some rocks and put them in a hot fire and you get lead at the bottom. As a metal, it was an easy one to work with, and that's why it was everywhere. And so, yeah, you would have your metal can that was lined with tin, because you couldn't put the steel or the iron next to the food because it would corrode. So you'd line it with tin, and that would preserve the metal. And then to hook it all together, like, now we have all these like cool mechanical crimpers, but back then they had small orphan children working for pennies a day.
I shouldn't laugh, but
I
that's
know
just
it.
so horrible.
Uh, and they would have them soldering these tops on, like they would hand cut the pieces of the can and then hand assemble them. So this is again why for a long time you probably had your crew still eating out of barrels, but the captain would have tinned food, or the upper deck crew would have the tinned food.
Were there any differences in this time period as far as how the food was prepared? Obviously, if they're eating the canned food, they would maybe just eat it right out of the can in a lot of cases, or perhaps heat it up a little bit.
It would sort of depend. Definitely sort of when you were fighting, or you were like hot bunking sailing and you were like having to move fast, 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 fast. Yeah, a lot of people were eating a lot of cold food. Like, you hear or read in books about sailing, and they're like, okay, before this fight starts, or before we start on this long transit or whatever, or the storm is coming, everybody gets a hot meal, and then you pitch the fire overboard so you don't burn the ship up. And so, yeah, in that case, they would definitely just be eating, the cold canned food. But once canning sort of got better, then the cook would actually use those as ingredients and like put it in a stew, sort of make different dishes. And since he's working with food that's already cooked in the cans, a lot less water is required. And so the food is actually better once they sort of get the technology up a little bit higher. I mean, I'm not excited about canned peas, but considering where they were coming from, I bet they were wonderful.
Better than maggot infested peas, or you
Oh,
know,
yeah, and they wouldn't rot. in there. They had some weird days where they're like, well, why do all these little cans? Those are a pain in the butt. Why don't we do like a really big can? And so they're trying like these cans that were like 17 pounds and 20 pounds, but you couldn't cook the inside of the can thoroughly, and so it would like rot and explode everything. And like, okay, fine, I'm gonna do the little cans. Boo.
At least they were trying something, at least.
Trying out lots of things. Like, it was like, well, round cans, they don't store as easily, but if, you're making square things, then they have corners, and those are a problem. And, how many edges do I want? There was a lot of experimenting, and when you're doing hand seams for all of the joins, you're going to go with as few as possible.
Now, something we haven't discussed yet at all, but is probably the most important, is a supply of fresh water, which was
yes,
historically a very difficult problem for ships. So how did that progress over time as these ships were trying to take these longer and longer voyages? How did they handle that as far as what did they take with them and how did they resupply?
Right. So the short answer is barrels.
Right.
The long answer is that, okay, so you leave port and you fill up as many barrels with water from your home port water supply. And then you also have beer. And then you also have a few barrels of medicinal brandy. Later on, it's going to be rum once the sugar trade starts going, because there is no more famous repurposing of industrial waste than rum.
Yeah.
Because they're like, God, this molasses stuff, it's everywhere. What do we do with it? And they're like, you could make it into booze. And they're like, sold.
Yeah. Well, you can ferment anything. So get cracking.
Right. And this is like sugar. So what's holding us up? They actually started out by making beer out of the molasses. That was terrible.
Yeah.
So they're like, what if we intensify this? So they're like, it's still terrible, but it'd get me drunk real fast. So good enough.
Good enough for sailors. They'll take it.
Exactly. So yeah, so you'd have your different barrels of different liquids. As you went out of port, actually the sailors would often drink the beer first because this was unpasteurized beer and it would go sour like that. Just like in a couple of weeks, it would just be unpalatable. And then you would drink the water. It often started growing interesting green stuff. If you look at sort of those cutaway versions of boats, they'll always have like a whole bunch of water barrels just like down in the hold.
Mm-hmm.
Please don't leak. Please don't leak. Please don't leak. I mean, one of the ship's carpenter's main jobs was to go and just like jiggle all the barrels and check the hoops and make sure everything was still tight and holding together, because these things would be jostling around all the time. And then while you were sailing, you would have to stop every X while to refill those water barrels. There were, people would rig sails to catch water when it rained and refill barrels. One of the interesting stories is that the mosquitoes in the Americas came from eggs in the barrels of water from Europe. And so they would fill up these barrels at like sort of the water sources near where the boats were, which were often like these sort of low-lying bogs, which tells you they weren't getting the best water. Some of it was kind of stagnant.
Yeah. And they're drinking this water with the mosquito larvae in it. And
yeah. So that's the other reason they were drinking the beer first, because I'm like, okay, I got choices here. Maybe the beer is better because you had to boil the mosquito larva before I drink it.
There's, in all the things that I've read about all the stories about ships. Inevitably, there's always something in there about having to drink this, fetid water with slime on top, and it tastes like oil because, you know, something has dripped into it or leaked into it somehow, or
Or what was that barrel used for last time? I mean, this is when people talk about, like, who invented charring barrels to age spirits in, I'm like, everybody. Because you'd get a barrel and it had fish in it or cheese in it or God knows what, and you're like, "Well, if I'm gonna use this again, I have to burn it before it's useful to this." And in fact, in the back of, 17th and 18th century cookbooks, there's instructions for, like, how to clean out barrels, and burning the inside of the barrels is one of the instructions.
yeah, and they had to try to sanitize as best they could because
Yeah.
it was just historically disgusting on board these ships. They really were
Oh, yeah.
disgusting.
Yeah, one of the ways that they would sanitize is they would take brimstone, which is a sulfur-containing rock, and burn it to, like, fumigate the inside of the ships or inside, and I know it from using it to clean barrels, and so when people are talking about, like, fire and brimstone, that is what they are talking about. This is what you burn to drive out all the bugs and the people and the smell, and everything smells like rotten eggs. It's fantastic.
And that's if they had a chance to do it, and if
Right.
the captain cared enough to have it done, but yeah, they would try to get the rats and the insects and the weevils and just
The lice.
they didn't
Don't
know
forget the
anything about,
lice.
microorganisms, but the the macroorganisms, yeah,
Right.
the lice, exactly, just, r just historically bad, very disgusting and uncomfortable on board ships, throughout the ages until recent times, and even now, it's probably not. I'm sure they do a pretty good job of keeping it clean, at least in the military ships.
I think it probably depends on, yeah, on your outfit. I mean, you think about the US Navy, I mean, for goodness sakes, they have ice cream. But if you're on one of these, like, black market ships catching bait for, quasi-legal shrimp farms, yeah, not life is not so good.
Right, right, on the commercial vessels and the not to degrade any specific industry, but, the fishing boats or the shrimp boats, the show where they catch the crabs or whatever, or
Oh,
the
Deadliest Catch,
deadliest
yeah.
catch, yeah. Um,
Yeah, those guys have it pretty good, but I'm not sure I'm not sure how clean they're keeping their bunk rooms in during the voyage when they're working those, like, 45-hour shifts or whatever.
well, being a bunch of guys on a boat, probably an occasional female too, but, how clean could it be?
Yeah. Yeah, which I that's one thing that always, like, got me because you have this image of, like, the sailors are always cleaning the deck of the boat and keeping everything, quote, unquote, "ship shape," but then you're like, "For the love of God, don't go below decks."
Keep the cameras up top.
Yeah.
Now I have a little bit of some fun here. I did a
Hmm,
little investigating, and I found a couple of recipes that I thought were interesting. I wanna see if you're familiar with them.
okay.
One is called Danderfunk. You ever heard of that one?
No.
Let me describe it.
Please.
It's you soak 6 biscuits and mash it up with
Okay.
a pestle, then you mix
Okay.
in fat taken from the pots where the meat had been previously boiled.
Oh, the slush!
The slush.
We
See,
forgot to talk about the
okay.
slush.
Yeah, the slush. And then flavor it with allspice, if available, it says. Then you wrap it all tightly in a pudding cloth, boil for 2 hours, and then slice it up and sweeten with molasses.
Okay, so yeah, this would be one of the desserts. And so when I just say slush, kind of jokingly, like, so this water that everything was boiled in repeatedly, like the fat would sort of come off all of the salt meat, salt pork, and it would just sort of like gather at the top.
Ugh.
And then, yeah, the cook would like scoop that off and save it and either use it for cooking or, yeah, like put it in a pudding, or you could spread it on your softened biscuit, or yeah, whatever. But yeah, it was called slush.
That's just so thoroughly disgusting. I can't even imagine. Oh my
It's
god.
like the opposite of rendered fat. It's like collected fat. It's got
Uh,
everything in
I'm
it.
just thinking of eating somebody's jar of bacon fat they've been saving for, you know, under their sink for weeks or something like that. Ugh.
Well, and then they add in like little bits of like that part that's on chicken that you're like, what was that? I don't know, but it's crunchy and weird. I'll just put that in there too.
Just throw it in the pot.
Yep.
How about this one? Salt junk. I chose this one just because of the names. So this one is very similar. You pound some biscuits into a powder, cut up
Okay.
salt meat or fish soaked overnight, tie it up tightly in a pudding cloth, boil for 2 hours, and slice it up.
It feels like all of this onboard cooking has a
Yeah,
theme,
it does.
and it's that you only have one way to cook everything.
Yeah. Just whatever you have, mash it up, put it in this pudding cloth, and boil it.
Yeah. So, right around the time that we're sort of cutting things off, like when we got some mechanical power in our boats, but just before that, navies started putting in stoves on their ships
Wow.
because they were sick of lighting their boats on fire from the galley
Right.
because they were literally putting a fire on a flammable floor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so one of the weirdest, coolest things about sort of studying food is that one of the first place a lot of American men saw an iron stove was serving in the American Navy. And the punchline, of course, is that we were buying these stoves from Britain while we were kind of fighting with them about the War of 1812. You know, just because we had a contract. Look.
Sure. Well, money is money.
Right. Yeah.
So, doesn't matter that we're at war. Just
Yeah.
doing business.
It's, yeah.
How did you get your start into this history of food?
I'd always sort of been interested in it. My background's in teaching chemistry, and chemistry is really just an over specialized culinary education. But my mom pointed out to me that in sixth grade, our class was, studying the ancient world and Rome. I made a Roman like chicken soup and made my own like stola that I dyed myself. And she's like, "Yeah, you've been trying to do this for a long time. You just forgot." So it was really during the pandemic that, I sewed a whole bunch of masks, and I would find myself, I'm like, yeah, Tuesday, 2 p.m. Sounds like a good time to start dinner. And where I live in Seattle, there's a road called Aurora Avenue or Highway 99. And like every grocery store from everywhere in the world is on this road. And so I just started cooking all of these cuisines from all over the world. I was like, how how am I able to do this? Why does American food work this way? And so that's why I started my podcast, because nobody else had it, and I was very curious.
Yeah, you're right. When I was looking at your podcast, when I first started speaking to you, I did notice that because I did a search and I found a couple that were loosely
Mhm.
related and some episodes from other podcasts that were about food, but there wasn't anything that was specifically about food the way, at least not the niche that you're talking about. Um, and it's quite interesting, and I think there's a lot of things that are discussed that people would be surprised about how they developed and where they came from.
Yeah, and the thing that really bowled me over is how much American food and technology play off of each other. Like, one thing causes the other, like, there's this, like, back and forth, back and forth. And so, as somebody who enjoys watching sort of prestige historical dramas, I was watching The Gilded Age, and that's right around when America is starting to get egg beaters. And because the wire technology has like gotten up to this point, and so that's when the angel food cake appears because more people can whip eggs, and it's just like those little connections all of the time. And so being an American food historian is also turns out I'm something of a technology historian, but specifically domestic technology.
There's an interesting episode of stuff you missed in history class is one of my favorites. But
Mhm.
they're talking about the invention of margarine and
Ooh.
how that changed everything and how it
Mm-mm-mm.
created this really intense battle and in the industry of what is margarine and what is butter and what could be called butter and how
Oh, the dye wars
the
are
dye wars,
just
yes,
spectacular. Like,
unbelievable.
they wanted like, the butter industry wanted you to dye it black or bright pink, and there's, like, this weird side light to World War II, where German shipping is, like, going out and getting all sorts of, like, cold water animal fats, penguin, seals, some whales, to turn into margarine to feed the war effort. And again, this is, like, more technology, like, as the whale lighting industry was falling off because people were getting electricity, the whaling industry is like, "What? What? We can't stop killing whales."
Well, you could.
And so chemistry had come to the point where they figured out how to take the smell out of the whale oil and make it into soap and make it into margarine. So, yeah, there was whale margarine there for a hot minute.
Glad I never partook of that. At least I don't think I did. Maybe I did. Um, it was
No, 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 no. That was like once the war was over, there was plenty of like other plant oils, and we needed to save the whale fluids for our transmissions in our
oh no.
70s cars.
That's depressing. Stop killing the whales.
I'm sorry.
I
You
did.
brought up margarine, and I can
I didn't
never
know about the whale oil.
I can never
I didn't
let
know
that
about the
go.
whale oil.
Yeah, whale soap. There's this really cute ad with this whale. It's like, look, he's squeaky clean. And you're like, no.
uh, what was your favorite episode that you've done on your podcast?
There, like, sort of each season, I kind of have a favorite, something that's sort of really surprising. So far this season, I think my favorite, hands down, is America's First Fad Diet in the early 1800s, where to regain manliness, you have to become a vegetarian.
Huh, interesting. That's
Yeah.
quite the opposite these days. If you're
Oh, absolutely. Because Sylvester Graham, the father of the graham cracker, who will never stop spinning in his grave after what they've done to his beautiful, terrible macho bread and have made it into a cinnamon sugar s'more vehicle.
and miniature cereal bites.
Right? But yeah, he was just like, no booze, no coffee, no tea, no spices, pumpkin spice, not even once. Um, and they had sort of come to the conclusion that the closest related animal to humans was the orangutan, and they are entirely vegetarian. And so to get back to our strong and pure, manly, God-given roots, we need to eat like the great apes. So, yes.
And yeah, that is quite the opposite because now we have what's the diet where they only eat raw
The
organ meat?
carnivore diet, yeah. And they're like, this is the perfect diet. This and the 300 vitamins I take on a weekly basis.
Your podcast is called The History of American Food. And where can people find it to give it a listen?
So I am sort of on any podcasting platform that's out there. My episodes so far also available on YouTube Music. The integration is stopping, so I'm going to have to post them manually now. Boo. So I might have to figure out a solution to that. But yeah, I'm around. I'm a little snarky on Threads. I occasionally post on Instagram. I am going to Romania for a week, and so
fun.
am going to look at because they're right near a giant salt mine, and so look into sort of like the culture of food preservation in a place that has plenty of salt and kind of what that looks like. I'm super duper excited about that and the pastry.
Well, Greta Harden, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on. This was a lot of fun.
I'm so glad we did this.
Other than a little bit of disease, we didn't talk about a huge tragedy and people drowning in the ocean or anything. So a little bit of a divergent episode for me, but very relevant and very informative. So
So just to end things on an even brighter note, one of my favorite pieces of fan art I've ever gotten is somebody sent me their picture of their quote unquote scurvy inspired Halloween costume. And I was like, oh my God, do I want to look at it? And what it was a couple that had gone as a sailor and a lemon. And so he'd go, oh no, I'm getting scurvy. And he would kiss. They kiss.
Did they have the fake bleeding gums and
Oh no,
degrading
no,
connective tissue?
Like, he's like, no, I'm healthy. Oh no, I'm getting scurvy. And then he'd kiss the lemon.
Aww.
And so it'd be sweet.
Yeah. I guess a lemon was a better choice than cabbage.
Yeah. Who wants to dress up as cabbage?
That's going to do it for Danderfunk, Salt Junk, and Scurvy, Cuisine Aboard Ships. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you to Greta Harden from the History of American Food podcast. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can find Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on shipwrecksandseadogs.com, as well as merch and all back episodes. If you're enjoying the show, you can make a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com, or you can subscribe to Into History. It is a collection of some of the best history podcasts available, including this one, all ad-free, and you get a private Discord community, bonus episodes, early access, and more. Subscribe at intohistory.com/shipwreckspod. Original theme music is provided by Sean Siegfried, and you can find him at seansiegfried.com. Please join me again next time. But until then, don't forget to drink your lime juice.